it's a little bit difficult to tell which civilization holds the title for having produced the oldest surviving poem that we still possess. If we look at the oldest civilizations where writing is praised and prized and that produces literature, we have these two civilizations kind of vying for oldest. It would be the Egyptian civilization and the Sumerian civilization. We know that there were Egyptian writings and literature, both funerary texts and religious hymns and narrative poems, as early as the 23rd to 25th century BC. So this is like 2300, 2500, 2600 might be the oldest surviving texts we have from Sumeria and Egypt. But if we want to think about sort of a fully fleshed out poem that seems to have a beginning, middle, and end, that has literary consciousness in it, you can tell the writer is trying to create a piece of literature as we understand it. Probably the earliest pieces of literature that we have that are pretty accessible for the modern reader would be the Sumerian stories about a king named Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh apparently lived somewhere in the middle second millennia BC and ruled over the city of Uruk. And we have these poems that have come down to us that may have been written as early as like 2100, 2200 BC, which tell different adventures and scenes in the life of Gilgamesh. And they were written in Sumerian, in the cuneiform script, which is one of the oldest scripts that we have that still exists, and ended up being a script that was used both by the Sumerians and then the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Hittites. They all sort of had a similar language group that they worked from. But the Sumerian was sort of the original language that they're all looking at and imitating and developing. So one of the first stories we have from these poetic narratives from the Sumerian is called Gilgamesh and Akka. And we meet this kind of interesting hero in Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh is a hero who's a bit like other heroes we meet in later Roman and Greek literature. He's a great king, he's mighty, he's proud in some of the stories, especially from Babylon a little later. His pride gets him into trouble sometimes. But in one of these very early poems from the Sumerian, we have this story of this king, Akka, who brings this invading army to take over Gilgamesh's city, Uruk. But Akka has a little bit of trouble because Gilgamesh is so magnificent and mighty. And there's this wonderful scene towards the end of the poem. The poem is a few pages long, where Akka has tried over and over to assault the city and it's not working. And Gilgamesh is like, I need to defeat this guy, Akka. So Gilgamesh decides to send his most trusted servant, a guy named Enkidu, out to face Akka. Gilgamesh peered over the wall. Looking on, Akka spied Gilgamesh. Akka said to Enkidu, "Slave, is that man your king?" Enkidu said, "That man is indeed my king." Even as Enkidu spoke, the multitude was overwhelmed, the multitude was stirred up, the multitude rolled in dust. All the foreign lands were overcome. The mouths of the land were filled with dust. The prows of the ship were broken, and Akka, king of Kish, was taken prisoner amid his troops. It's very over the top. Just saying that Gilgamesh is your king is enough to destroy the hosts of the enemy. The prows of their ships are broken just by this statement that Gilgamesh is your king. Now we could say, well, perhaps this is a metaphor for once it was stated by Enkidu that Gilgamesh is his king. Maybe the armies rushed in and there was battle, but it foreshortens it for poetic effect. Gilgamesh is not just a king who can overcome his mortal enemies. He's a king who sometimes goes out into the wild and fights, crazy wild men, sometimes fights monsters and dragons. And there are several stories, both in Sumerian and Babylonian, of Gilgamesh sort of overcoming these supernatural creatures, rather like the Heracles stories later. But Heracles, perhaps, is imitating earlier Gilgamesh stories. But Gilgamesh isn't just a hero who goes around defeating mortal and supernatural enemies. He's a hero who in many of the stories about him, always ends up facing his own mortality as his ultimate enemy. Sure, I can overthrow a dragon or a demigod or, a king who comes against me, but what about death? And this is where I think Gilgamesh, as probably the earliest hero we have in poetry, is so pertinent to us today. There's a sequence in the Sumerian Gilgamesh stories called the Death of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh realizes, I'm going to die. And he's mourning this. He's so sad that he's mortal. And he has this dream. And he comes before the council of the gods. And the gods basically give him these wise instructions, not just to encourage him, but to enlighten him as he faces his own mortality. One of my favorite parts is this. Great mountain Enlil, father of the gods, spoke to me, the Lord Gilgamesh, in the dream. Gilgamesh, your fate was destined for kingship. It was not destined for eternal life. May your heart not sorrow that human life must end. May your spirit not be crushed. May your heart not be aggrieved. The misfortune of mankind has come for you, so I have decreed. What was set at the cutting of your umbilical cord has come for you, so I have decreed. The darkest day of mankind has overtaken you. The loneliest place of mankind has overtaken you. The inexorable flood has overtaken you. The struggle with no escape has overtaken you. The unequal clash has overtaken you. The fight with no reprieve has overtaken you. This is very high-sounding language, and it's very doom-like. But this god is saying, hey, look, you got to be a great king in life. But now you're going through what everyone has been destined for, every mortal man. You're going through the darkest day, the loneliest place, the inexorable flood, the struggle with no escape, the unequal clash. All of these wonderful descriptions of death and of humans facing mortality are given to us. And it's almost as if Gilgamesh becomes for us this man who, through reading about him, teaches us how to face death, teaches us how to accept our own mortality. Now, it's interesting because Gilgamesh has been so great in life that later in the same section, the gods kind of promise that Gilgamesh will be given pride of place in the afterlife. He'll be one who kind of rules over and governs and properly manages the other spirits. So something is promised to Gilgamesh that maybe isn't promised to all of us. But there's this real acknowledgement that a poetry about great men, about heroes, about people who just their very name can crush armies, they too will die. They too will face the mortality that all men face. Later in Babylonian history, around the 1700s down into the 1200s, there was this project that the Babylonians had of taking these Sumerian stories and kind of compiling them into a single narrative. It's a couple thousand lines long, about Gilgamesh's adventures from his early reign all the way up through his facing mortality towards the end of his life. And this is available in a lot of recent translations as the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the Epic of Gilgamesh is really worth reading. But one of the things that's fun to do is to look back at the Sumerian texts that were written maybe even as early as 500 or more years before that to see what are these shorter narratives that the Babylonian is drawing from. And I think this idea of kingship is heroic, kingship is dear. A man who says, that's my king, is a man who can destroy armies with his loyalty. And yet, in the end, all men must face death. Yet the gods may ease that passing. And through meditating on our mortality, we may gain a wisdom that isn't gained through winning battles, through, defeating monsters, but only is gained looking death in the face and asking the gods, why does it all matter? What is it all for? Why must I die? So the Gilgamesh story is always a little bit of a sobering reminder that even really early on in human history, the question of mortality is on the mind of the early poet, and that our earliest heroes won't let us get away from their stories until we face our own questions about the ultimate ends and ultimate meanings of life. Next time, we're going to look at an Egyptian hero who's pretty different than Gilgamesh, who comes right on the heels of Gilgamesh in early poetic history.